which I use a basic model taking you all the way from influence to participation, which I've kind of reproduced here. As you can see, they do about four of these different models, if I'm correct, yeah. And they all start with a various external influence of parental or peers, things like socioeconomic status, parental political behaviors or political orientations, or high school activities and peer influence. And they then connect these to the civic orientations of the students being studied both as students and then later as young adults later on in their lives. So it's what's called a longitudinal study that tracks them over time, and they have to take surveys again and again to kind of track these changes. And then finally to their participation as young adults, because obviously as students up until when you're in your later years of high school, you're not going to be eligible to vote, so participation is somewhat limited. So it's most useful to measure political participation anyway as young adults. And you can see I bolded kind of that main path there, but then there are some kind of dotted paths that all represent other strong relationships that could exist. Parental influence will also exert some influence on young adult participation. Even as young adults, our parents play a role in our lives. It'll still play a role in our civic orientations, and because there's going to be a strong relationship between the youth and young adult and civic orientations, our civic orientations as youth are also going to influence our participation. So, but the main path is kind of that one going around the outside there. Moving on to mass media influence, one of the things, just going back real quick, the influences that Beck and Jennings use in their studies, and what most of political socialization uses, focus very much on these personal factors. And there's a pretty good reason for this as actually we start looking at mass media influence, that that was where really any sort of political communications and influence became a major factor worthy of study. People started looking at radio and the emergence of television in the early part of the century as these unprecedented ways to reach countless numbers of people, and had concerns about what effect this would have on the masses if one opinion was going to hold sway based on people were just going to do what television and radio told them, kind of the War of the Worlds effect, so to speak. And one of the first significant works, Personal Influence, really kind of worked to temper those anxieties about mass media, saying that mass media is going to set a more national dialogue and kind of set the foundations for what we're talking about. Ultimately, personal influence is what's going to reign, and they did kind of a small town study and analyzed who the various opinion leaders were and whose opinion mattered on what, and really came to this conclusion that it was the people and their personal opinions and that personal level of influence that was most important. And this was an opinion that pretty well held sway until you really saw in the 1990s more people turning to be critical of television as an influential force in kind of political socialization and building social capital in general. One of the most notable critics was Robert Putnam, who wrote an article, Tuning In, Tuning Out, discussed how he felt that television and the rise of mass media really was the chief reason behind the declining civic participation and social capital in our society. One of Putnam's more famous books that kind of had some crossover appeal when it was written was a book called Bowling Alone, in which he measured civic participation by membership in bowling leagues. And his whole general argument was that we're becoming, as a society in general, less and less apt to interact with each other and discuss with each other in all facets of life. And one of the main contributors to this that he blamed was mass media. Then kind of taking a middle road here was Diana Mutz in a book she cleverly titled Impersonal Influence, in which she said that in this mass media age, political learning was very much dominated by mass media opinions, that what we see on television has a greater capacity than what we read in newspapers or magazines to really serve for us as a reflection of reality. But that this is still integrated with personal experiences and influences to a certain extent. So it was kind of this that led me to develop. It was probably Mutz's discussion, most of all, that led me to develop what I'm terming as the impersonal political influence theory, in which I kind of asked myself if I was to take the data that Beck and Jennings did, and from their models and update them, because that survey data, the article was written in 1982, the survey data was taken about a decade before that. You know, if I were to take some more recent survey data, what would things look like? The first thing I said, my first kind of prediction was that that model that they came up with would basically still be validated. The relationships would more or less be the same. You'd still have that path from influence to orientations to participation. However, with the more recent data, my prediction was two things would have significantly weaker relationships. The relationship between the civic orientations and the personal influence at the beginning, and then at the end there, the relationship between your orientations and participation. Because if we're looking at declining participation, and then we're looking at orientations as the chief kind of motivator of participation, the prediction would be that there'd be some sort of disconnect. Then thirdly, was to kind of expand the scope of what they were covering in their model from just those personal influence factors to add in factors of impersonal influence as represented by the mass media. And that if you took them side by side and kind of made two wings to the model, that impersonal wing would have a stronger relationship than the personal wing, kind of indicating this growth in mass media. So this was kind of what I was going into as I went to perform original research. And so first of all, of course, to do original research, you need to have a good data set. Fortunately, I spent the past year, as I said, working with the longitudinal study of American youth that was beneficial as a data set for many reasons, which I'll discuss. From there, I'll talk about how I took that data and constructed it into measures similar to those in the Beck and Jennings study. And then finally, I'll show an example of some of the path models I came up with and kind of talk about what they mean as